Okay, this is Mr. Coumbe. So now we're talking about the sorts of phenomena that might happen within the experiments itself due to particular behaviors of not only the participants but also behaviors of the experimenters themselves. And because of these behaviors and these phenomena, we can introduce bias and we can confound the results of our experiment, and we're not actually, it's going to affect our ability to generalize our results. The first one is called the placebo effect, also known as the expectancy effect. And it's where you give the participants, and it's usually the control group, something called a placebo, and it's usually a fake procedure or a fake drug. So a lot of the times it's like sugar pills. You apply it to the control group, being the group that doesn't receive the IV, just to see if it was actually the IV that was affecting it, or was it just some sort of psychological benefit that, like self-belief, that the participants were actually looking at. And that's what the placebo effect is. It's a change in that participant's behavior because they expect that they're going to receive the IV. They're going to receive the treatment. So because they think they are, it's some psychological effect that causes them to maybe actually receive the effects, even though they weren't getting the IV. Right, so in this example, if we say like Kinkatunka, he says, I'm going to give you guys the crystals, and so he tells this to everyone, I'm going to give you guys crystals, it's going to make you guys stronger in the force. And then the guys are like, yep, that's awesome, fantastic, please give it to us, we want it. And then he splits them into those two groups. In one group, so he's told them that, he's giving them to them all. And one group actually had, so the group to the left actually had the force aumenta, whereas the other one just had some sugar crystals. They crushed it up and they took it and they were like, ooh, this is going to make us, this drug is going to make us stronger force users. And then we have a look. So if then we actually do the procedure, on the left is where there was no placebos, whereas on the right, the placebo was given to, so on the left being one, they knew that the one group was receiving the force aumenta, and the other group, the control group, knew that they weren't getting it. Whereas on the right, they all thought that they were actually getting it. Now you can see very, very clearly that there is a placebo effect. So if these guys on the left, these guys were in the control group, so they knew they weren't getting the IV, they weren't getting the force-enhancing crystals, and that's their actual natural ability without force enhancement. Whereas if you look, when they thought that they were getting the procedure, only one of them, which is this guy right down here, he's the only one whose performance actually decreased, whereas everyone, especially Darth Maul, have a look, his performance significantly increased just by thinking that he was getting this procedure. So clearly we can see that there's a placebo effect in that particular one. All right. So then we, in order to try to mitigate the placebo effect, to try to stop it from happening, we do something called a single blind experiment. Right? Well, that's where you tell the participants they don't know whether they're going to be in the control or the experimental group. So it gives them that sort of doubt that, oh, I could be getting, for in this instance, I could be getting the force aumenta, or I might not. I might be getting sugar. So that's what Kikutuko says. You might get a force enhancing crystal, but then again you might not. And the guys are like, yeah, well, I don't know about that. All right, I'll do it anyway. So then puts them in those groups again, and the same sort of results. So the group on the left still got the force aumenta, whereas on the right, now psychologically, all the participants are thinking. So even the guys on the left, even the ones that did get the force aumenta, they were in doubt of whether they got it or not. And on the right hand side, same thing. They're in doubt. I could have gotten it, but I may not have. But we know as the experimenter that the group on the left got it and the group on the right did not. Okay? And so that will affect the results of the experiment essentially. So it will stop that placebo effect of the ones that didn't, so the ones in the control group on the right. So for them thinking that they got it, so putting that doubt in their minds stops any sort of psychological placebo effect. However, the behavior of the experimenter also affects the actual experiment significantly, because the experimenter themselves, they're human. So a lot of the times they're going to have variables in themselves. They're going to have like their own particular way of reacting, like physically reacting. They're going to have their own values. They're going to have their own attitudes. They're going to have their own expectations. They're going to behave a particular way. That could potentially bias the results, because sometimes because the experimenter has to actually report, has to observe, has to record, has to interpret all the data that comes through. And so depending on the way that the experimenter does that, it's going to affect potentially and bias our final results. So let's say Kinkatuko, who was like, oh, he really likes Master Yoda. Master Yoda has got a really good reputation. So instead of giving it to the other group, I think whatever group that Master Yoda is going to be in, I'm going to give the Force Element crystals to him because I really like him. And that introduces a big bias, because it's not giving all groups that equal chance of getting the Force Elementa. So in order to prevent this, you do something called a double-blind experiment, where the experimenter nor the participants know which group they're in. So the participants nor the experimenter knows who's receiving the IV and who is not, and who is a control group. So in this particular one, so Kinkatuko says, all right, you might be getting the crystals or not, so that's to prevent our placebo effect. And then everyone's like, well, yep, whatever, sure. And then Kinkatuko leaves. He leaves before they are split into those groups. Now we know still, so a lot of the times it might be some assistants that will actually do this part of the experiment, where they distribute they allocate groups without the researcher actually knowing. And so in this one, we know which ones they are because they glowed, and then they did the force push, and then Kinkatuko comes along as the experimenter and then sees it afterwards, and he has no idea who took the drug and who did not. So he can just see just the results. So that way, he couldn't influence. So if, for example, he likes Jedis and he would have preferred for them to have really, really good results, then he might have given it just to the group with most Jedis. Then in this way, it gives everyone a bit more of an equal run at getting the actual IV. So it reduces that bias significantly. And if you look here, Yoda and Darth Maul, they had quite close abilities anyway. They were all really quite high. And yes, that's it. So my next lesson is going to be on ethics and principles that surround the study of psychology. So I hope you enjoyed my Star Wars examples. Let me know if you have any questions. But other than that, this is Mr. Coumbe, and that is Research Methods.